Ladies and gentlemen, it's time for Justa's Conversation, right here on Usala Radio, with your host, Brian O'Neill and Luis Gonzalez.
Hello, everybody, to another edition of A Justice Conversation. I am Suave Gonzalez. My co-host, Dr. Brian O'Neill, could not be here this week, but he sent his love and respect. But as always, we got one of our hosts here. Doc, how you doing?
Good.
You know, it's
Happy
an honor.
to be here.
It's an honor to have you here. You know, when this conversation came up to have Dr. Larry Turetsky here, I said we got to have Doc in there. You know, because I just think there is a conversation that needs to be had, and that people in the community need to understand that this conversation could potentially help their loved one in
Yes.
prison. So I'll give you the floor. You can start it off. Let's take it.
All right. So we're interviewing a neuroscientist, Dr. Larry Turetsky, today. And I have just a little introduction of him, and then we're going to hear from him directly. So I'm reading from an article about him and his colleague, Dr. Kirtley Thornton. And it says, Philadelphia native Dr. Larry Turetsky and his colleague, Dr. Kirtley Thornton, have developed a scientific protocol to attack not the economic and social conditions that reformers like RDA Larry Krasner regard as the root causes of pathological behaviors, but the neurological conditions of our individual minds. So this is brain-based work that he's doing. Turetsky and Thornton contend that changing those behaviors requires changing our mental, quote-unquote, hardware that processes environmental stimuli before, quote-unquote, software upgrades like counseling or education or vocational training. Their program uses QEEG, which is you're going to say it.
Electroencephalography.
There you go.
Fancy word.
That technology. Yes, wires stuck to your head.
That's the better way, yes.
To detect abnormal brainwave patterns corresponding to addiction or that might result in criminal behavior.
Mm-hmm.
By tracking those patterns, recommending and rewarding corrective paths back to brainwave symmetry, their method seeks to fortify strong neurologic foundations to better receive therapy, education, and other pro-social inputs. So, I am very interested in having you kind of fill us in a little bit on how this works, what QEEG is, how it works, what you actually do, and in particular, maybe speaking on the Peniston Protocol.
Okay.
That's Suave's phone. All right. Maybe speaking on the Peniston Protocol and kind of giving us a sense, and it's here in your materials, that there is a possibility of a neuro-behavioral healing.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, you said it. The summary was great. I mean, that's
Thank
exactly
you.
what we're here going to talk about, and you said it probably better than I could. So thank you for having me, first of all. I appreciate you guys giving me the time
Sure.
to
We're happy
speak
to have
out,
you
tell
here.
your audience, and get this. It seems like everybody wants criminal reform. You know, Democrats, Republicans, young, old, rich, poor, incarcerated, not incarcerated. Everybody sees something in criminal reform, whether it's tax savings or cost savings or the concept of morality issue, and of course the biggest thing, which is the reduction of crime. So
Absolutely.
everyone's
And
in
the
on this.
reduction of incarcerating people as well.
If it reduces crime, yeah. I mean, the goal is to reduce crime. How we do it is the experiment. But the goal is to reduce crime, not just reduce incarceration or legalize drugs or things like that. We're trying to reduce crime. But to what you said in your summary is exactly true. So the neuroscience field has grown in the past few decades. And we have the technology now to see and do things that we couldn't have thought of 50 years ago, 100 years ago, when psychology was really a beginning field. So they didn't know what we know now, and that's okay. Science progresses. And so what we found is that behavior, mental states, and behavior, so the things that we think about, things that we are driven to, driven away from, and our behavior, what we do, what we don't do, those come from the brain. only the brain. So the brain has to make the call and make it work. So just because something's in front of you doesn't mean you have to grab it. Your brain is going to make that decision and also how you're going to do it. So knowing that piece of information, that the brain is the most important, relevant part in behavior, now the question just becomes, how can we, work with the brain to make things better? The old theories of the past 5,000 years was that you change your environment, right? So you have this free will, and if you change the things around you, that'll change your behavior. So it's sort of a carrot and a stick. If we incentivize you to do something, that's what you'll do. But the brain has its own workings and it needs nerve connections to make things work. And if these nerve connections aren't working right, then the carrot and the stick thing won't work. For example, you can put, drugs on the table, and to me that means nothing. I have no need to use heroin. For other people, it's a major draw. The heroin's the same. The table hasn't moved, but the person is going to be drawn or not drawn based on how their brain is working. So we can talk more about how the brain develops these connections, how the abnormal parts kind of happen, and maybe what we can do about them. But the main point is that the brain is in control of mental states and behavior, that it's not a two-way street, that environment can influence these connections, but they don't change abnormal behavior patterns. And neuroscience is now finding new ways to try to deal with that.
When you say abnormal, I understand what that means, but I think it would be interesting to think just a little deeper on this because, we're talking about neural connections, right? And I think that means we're talking about neurotransmitters.
It's part of the process, but it turns out the most important process is the physical connection structure.
Okay.
It's not the neurotransmitters.
The circuits.
I'll give you an example. If I inject, we know that testosterone, for example, is correlated to aggressive behavior. That's why 90% of all crime is committed by men. Okay, so we know that testosterone's in there somewhere. So the question becomes, well, if we manipulate this testosterone, can we increase or decrease crime? Right? If they used to think this, castration and other things, and to some extent we still have this neurotransmitter mentality. But the story goes like this. So there were studies done. Most people probably have heard of this work from Robert Sapolsky at University of California. He's a researcher, a neuroscientist, and started out actually as an anthropologist, going out into the field with apes, and he was out there in the field. But one of the things he talks about is if you inject testosterone into a female at 200% the amount of normal testosterone, she doesn't become violent. If you inject high levels of testosterone over periods of time into chimps, they become very violent. If you inject 200 or many, many times the amount of testosterone into humans, particularly, let's say, Buddhist monks, they don't become violent. So what's going on here? We take a human, let's say a Buddhist monk, we give them all this testosterone, you would expect them to increase their violence, right? Their aggressiveness. It's not what we see. We actually see the opposite. What you see is Buddhist monks actually competing to do good deeds because their brain structure from childhood is trained to do what we would call good deeds. So to do things for others, to look for peaceful ways of resolving conflict, meditation, the list. I'm not a Buddhist monk. I don't want to speak like one, but they do certain things that sort of train their behavior a certain way. And then if you go in there with this testosterone, instead of stimulating aggressiveness, what you stimulate is what's already connection patterns are there, which is the good behavior. And so testosterone, it turns out, is not an aggressive type of hormone. It is a competitive sort of desire to be the alpha male, just to see who gets to the top of the food chain hormone. It's a competitive hormone. So the Buddhist monks actually compete and get sort of really into it on how to do good deeds, where a woman becomes more socially active. And the chimps, who we are 99% related to, 98, 99%, are direct descendants through evolution, they become crazy violent. So what's going on? it's not really the neurotransmitter. It's the connection pattern. That's what I meant to say.
Got you.
Yeah.
And so then I'm wondering, because we're going to get into this more, that one of the things you're doing is retraining these connections, right?
That's what we try to do, yeah.
Yes, through the biofeedback.
Well, not myself. I'm not practicing anymore. I don't practice in the
Okay.
field. I'm not licensed to practice. But this work is being done by lots of others, including Curtly Thornton you mentioned, and other doctors that are actively practicing in the field.
Got you.
But yeah, they try to do this.
Yeah. So my question then is, those when you say testosterone is injected and it just works in to make people to have their already existing brain patterns to do
Exactly.
certain things, right? So my question becomes then, we're talking here about criminality in one thing and substance abuse is another thing in terms of the way this stuff has been, the way the QEEG has been used,
You got it.
right?
You got it.
Then are we saying that there's something deterministic about these brain patterns that get laid down in childhood?
Well, that's a great point. So here's how the story goes. 50%, so the brain has about 86 billion neurons. Okay, this is optimum conditions, right? No one's ever counted them, but there's a woman, Housel, who's actually had the best technique for counting. She has the best cited work and the most accurate work in nerve cell studies. What she found was there's about 86 billion neurons, and each one of these neurons can make thousands of connections. Each one can have one connection or it can be linked up into thousands of connections. So now we're talking on the order of, if you do the math, it's about 10 to the 13. So you're talking trillions and trillions of connections. More connections in a person's brain than there are grains of sand on the earth. In every one of us.
Wow.
So, well, it's the size doesn't matter, it's connections matter. So to get to your point, to my point is, so about 50% of those trillions of connections, 50% is given to you by mom and dad. So there's the deterministic part. You didn't pick mom, you didn't pick dad. We came out and that's what we got. Now, the other 50% is going to come through our environment based on what our environment is around us. And so most of that, about 95% of those connections come before the age of 7. Some say
Wow.
5. Now you do the math, that's about 1,000 connections a second for 7 years. So now the question becomes, how do we make those connections that are coming anyway? They're coming anyway. They're designed genetically. 50% you got before you even took your first breath. The other, let's say 49% are coming over the next 7 years. They're coming anyway. Now, the question becomes, how do you entice these connections to make, let's say, efficient? I don't want to say bad or good. Let's just say the efficient, adaptive connections. We want to adapt to our environment.
Yeah.
If something happens to us, we want to adapt. If something is a threat to us, we need to adapt and respond in let's say, a forceful way. But we don't want to respond like that to everything. Just because we had a hard day at work, you don't want to come home and respond, and have a screaming match over the trash. Who takes out the trash? So we all have to respond to our environment. Those connection patterns are not deterministic, that other 50%, but they come through our environment, which again we largely can't control. So when I say 0 to 7, I mean, us humans, we don't even get a chance to talk until about 2. So we're really not involved in this conversation of connection pattern making. So here's the thing. If you have a abnormal environment, let's say an environment that's not healthy, okay, let's not say abnormal, maybe unhealthy.
I don't want to cut you off, but we are going on a commercial break right now.
Okay, let's talk
You're
about that
listening
later.
to Dr. Larry Tereski on Osala Radio on a Justice Conversation. We'll be right back.
Evacuate. Communicate. Make your emergency plan today.
Welcome back to A Justice Conversation. If you're listening to Suave Gonzalez, Dr. August Terra, and Dr. Larry Tereski in the studio, we're discussing the brain science. Before we went on the commercial break, you were saying.
She asked about the connection patterns, determinism, that kind of thing, how these connections are made. So we said that 50% come from genetics, from mom and dad. You don't have a say in the matter. Most of the 50% happen before the age of 7, where you have little to say on the matter, and it's mostly based on your environment. So the key thing, and pediatricians now talk about this, they call them adverse child events, ACEs.
ACEs.
Yeah, ACEs, yeah. And so they're actually required to do these lengthy questionnaires and so forth when they suspect there's some issues. It turns out a lot of people have issues. I don't know the exact percentages because it depends on how much severity. There's a point scale system. But a lot of people have issues. But not everybody commits an addiction or a crime. So what we have to address is not only to reduce these adverse childhood events, but also what to do about it. Now, what causes an adverse childhood event? We'll just bring you the categories. It could be nutritional issues. These are long-term, not just about having a McDonald's hamburger one time. We're talking about long-term nutritional deficiencies, particularly of fish oils and fats, those kind of things. But there's more. It could be physical abuse, someone that just was punched in the head too many times or played football too much as a child. And I'm talking about sort of long-term. That's a phone again.
It's you again.
And it could be emotional abuse. It could be sexual abuse. It could be any kind of thing that affects the brain's development, and this usually happens through cortisol. That's the magic word. Mm-hmm. That's how an emotional thing or a sexual assault could affect, because person's stress levels go up. We even know that poverty, simply not having enough money, and the number is 25. We even know the number. It's $25,000. So if you have a family of 2 children and 2 adults that make $25,000 or less, which is, interestingly enough, is the poverty line in the U.S. today, the official federal poverty line. It was increased by Obama's healthcare plan in 2012. But around 25,000, that seems to be the number where we see children have difficulty adapting to their environment later on. Now, they don't know about money. They don't know that dad's losing his job every 6 months. But what they do feel is the stress that's in the family dynamics. And that cortisol is what's affecting these connections.
Yes.
So those are the various things that can cause this other 50% to be, let's say, unhealthy. The problem is, now we all grow up with trauma, right? No one had perfect parents. Nobody had perfect nutrition. Nobody has perfect anything. But the problem is when these abnormal or unhealthy connection patterns, when they stay too long, they develop into unhealthy mental states and behaviors. So they have a difficulty with these higher level brain functions like understanding consequences, having impulsivity, having empathy, having the ability to socially relate to other people, strategic planning. If I go to school now, in 4 years, something really great's going to happen, right?
The marshmallow study that they did with children.
That's the most studied experiment in the history of psychology, is the marshmallow study.
And they're questioning it now. I just
No,
heard.
it's the most, well, I don't know how
No,
you...
they're questioning the experiment now.
Oh, they're looking into it.
The idea that you can delay reward or not delay reward.
You can actually see with the marshmallow experiment, and I don't want to go too deep in the woods on this, but there's a linear relationship. In other words, it tracks 1-to-1 up the scale the amount of time that a child is able to resist the marshmallow or cookie, or they use sort of, it depends, it's age dependent. Sometimes it's a puppet or something. Most of the time it's food. So they can track not only did you eat the cookie, but how fast did you eat the cookie? Was it in the first minute, the first 10 minutes, and so forth? Usually there's a 10 to 15 minute window that they're looking for. And then for those that aren't familiar with the marshmallow experiment, you have a young child about 3, 4, 5, 6 years old, somewhere in there. They usually most of the time do these studies with, and they give them some kind of reward like a candy or cookie, and they leave them in a room that's pretty much not too much stimulation in the room, pretty drab, and so they basically say, here's a cookie. They put it on a plate. Mom walks away. It says, if You don't touch that cookie or whatever.
There's one other part to it, though.
Yes.
It's that they put the treat down
Mm-hmm.
and they say to the child, if you can either have double,
Right.
that you can have 2 marshmallows if you can wait
That's
a
right.
certain amount of time.
That's right.
Or you can have this one now.
Right. So I was getting that. So yeah, they come back in about 10 to 15 minutes, and if the child did not eat the candy or cookie, then he gets 2 cookies or candies or whatever. And so the idea is to see if this child can have delayed gratification. But where does that come from? I don't know about free will. I mean, a 3-year-old child is really not really conscious enough to really exercise free will. So it's coming from these sort of connection patterns that are already
Can I
established.
say that? They
Sure.
say that about juveniles when they commit crime, that a 16, 14, 15 is not really in the capacity to understand what they did. And that what the Supreme Court ruled?
That's true, and so and they ruled it because of an anatomical changes in the brain. They didn't say even neurotransmitters, because we all have dopamine from the day we're born. We all have testosterone. Well, at least men do. Well, women do too, but not much. From the day we're born, we all have epinephrine and all these fancy scientific words. So, is it really free will that this 12-year-old or so had committed a violent crime? I'm not excusing or defending the criminal act. It's the opposite. We're trying to be hard on crime. It's just, how do you do it? And so that our argument is you got to use the brain. So yeah, you're right. So
because I want to get into the now that we got the medical perspective,
The brain.
and
That's all you gotta know.
conversation. Let's
Brain
get into the
connections,
heart
yeah.
of
Brain
the
connections.
of the issue.
Right.
You know, how did your science
Right.
help the brothers in prisons and the sisters upon release, or while they're still in prison?
Well-
How did that connection happen?
The people that do this work are trying to retrain the brain, like a physical therapy. We're trying to increase the parts of the brain that are working really well and reduce the parts of the brain that are not too healthy. And the result we would expect, because we're dealing with these connection patterns that are causing the problem, we would expect that mental states and behavior would change. And we find that is true, that it does. So that's how we expect to do it. Now,
But do we
how
need-
we do it is
do we
another
need
issue.
science for that? Because
Oh, yeah.
because traditionally it could be said that when you spend a lengthy amount of time in prison,
Yeah.
The criminal behavior falls as you age. So do I need science for that? Or do we just let them sit in jail for 30, 40 years with the hope that by the time we release them at an old age, their crime desires are reduced?
But are we going to wait 30 years for everyone that commits a crime? I mean, it's too expensive to do that. $50,000 a year in state prison, we just can't afford to do that. So, I mean, yeah, I guess you could just put everyone away who stole a pack of gum for 30 years and wait till their brain changes just from degeneration of age. But we can't afford to do that. So, and there's a moral issue to that. And by the way, the Supreme Court, you mentioned a number of times, and state and federal law in every state says that punishment, that corrective efforts are mandatory. Prison is not a primarily retributive
Retributive,
goal.
yeah.
Retributive goal. In fact, you can be retributive as long as it's for corrective purposes. The most important establishment of prison is to correct. So if we put someone for 30 years who stole a pack of gum, are we really correcting, or are we just waiting for them to age out?
But there is not correction happening in
But that's,
prison.
Not according to the
question.
recidivism rates. There definitely isn't.
Correct what?
So we're trying to improve these brainwave patterns.
You mean correct
No.
what in prison?
You said that the Department of Correction,
Oh.
Supreme Court, even there's to correct what? What do the Department of Correction supposed to correct?
To reform their behavior to be more adaptive to society so they can get a job and do whatever. That's the
and
goal.
they do that. What's their definition of correction?
Not committing another crime. It depends who you're talking to. Like, parole department would see a success as one thing, prisons another. The tax man would see success as another. So I would say that I think everyone would agree that if you didn't get rearrested or committed another crime, that would be success.
Well, that
But
would be
but does that change the pattern? Because I could play the game. I
you're
know
right.
plenty of guys
You're right, that don't
in
get
the
caught.
prison that you take
Yeah.
the worst guy in society, put him in a prison, right? And
Right.
that would become your model prisoner.
Exactly.
But
That's
had
why,
that guy really changed?
Exactly, Swab. It's a great point. So,
So-
to the neuroscientist, to someone who understands the neurology of behavior, success is not just committing another crime, yes or no. Success is, did you adapt into the world that you were put back into? Did you get a job? you don't have to have an education, but if that's what you want to pursue, could you accomplish that? Can you have social relationships? If you have children, are you a successful parent? Are you positive in their life? Can you pay your taxes? Can you independently live? Not just are you sitting on a step and just not getting into trouble anymore. Success is really a cornucopia of things. It's not getting rearrested, that we hope, not having another crime. That's the biggest goal. But can you also adapt and support yourself? We don't want you to be a burden on the political or economic systems either. If you come out of jail and you live off the government for the next 50 years, is that success? Well, if you could do better, you should do better. I mean, so success is, different. Like I said earlier, everyone has a different version of success. To a clinical behavioral scientist, success is adapting to your life in the most successful and progressive way possible. Achieving your goals that you want to do, not just staying out of prison or not getting arrested.
To a neuroscientist,
because anyone can commit crimes and just not get arrested if you're really good at it.
So to a neuroscientist like you, what is your suggestion?
I suggest
how did you came up with this new, if we want to call it new?
QEEG.
I didn't come up
neurofeedback.
with it. All right. So the things that I'm saying is not about me. I didn't come up.
No, I'm
with
talking about. Let me correct myself.
Right.
How did you come up to connect the science
Right.
with the Man Up group in Gratifield Prison?
That's a great question.
And how did you came to the conclusion that the brothers in prison are going to conduct
Correct. So
these tests?
Well, I mean, I was a practicing physician for 8 years. I got my clinical science, neuroscience degree in the late 90s and had performed some of these things that we were talking about. Neurofeedback, I guess, is the commonly used word. EEG, biofeedback, if you want to say. So, and I've been in that part of the world. I've also been through the criminal justice program, and I've seen the prison from the inside. For 8 years, I was at SCI Rockview and the county jails and other things, and I've seen it from the inside. So I've lived the life of the successful doctor, and I've also been with thousands of people that committed some horrible crimes, and I've had a chance to talk to people that commit crimes, and I've had a chance to talk to people that do commit crimes, and what I've found reinforced kind of what I already knew though coming in, which is the brain is what's causing the behavior, good or bad. Okay, so the question is, how do you emphasize the good and de-emphasize the bad? And
how do you do that?
So
how would you do that?
Well, I don't do it, but the people that do it would first you got to do a proper diagnosis. So you have to, again, if the problem is in the brain, that's where you got to go first. So you take what's called a quantitative electroencephalograph. That's the fancy word. The abbreviations are QEEG. And it's basically kind of an MRI, but instead of using radiation or radioactive substances or that big MRI machine, you use a very simple electrodes. You put a series of electrodes on the head. There's about 19 of them. Put them in a standard, what they call 10-20 setup. It's the standard medical placement locations for these electrodes. And you pick up what's coming out for free of our heads all the time. For those who remember your old high school physics, every time you have an electrical current, you have a magnetic wave perpendicular to that. So if you imagine an electrical, and that's everything, the microphones in this room, the television in your house, every time you have an electrical current going left to right, from top to bottom is this magnetic wave. So the question becomes, we have a way to listen in on the language of the brain. The brain is talking in electricity, not even neurotransmitters, which is why they're so poorly correlated to crime. And why manipulating them doesn't really get us long-term results, because the brain will rewire, right? Any doctor should tell you that.
We're going to leave it right there. We got to go on a commercial break.
One more commercial.
But when we come back, we want you to describe to the people
More of the treatment, yeah.
why this treatment is important,
Okay.
and how it could help their loved one in prison. Because we have a lot of people tuning in, and those are some of the questions that's coming in.
Okay.
Being prepared is a part of who you are. But it's especially important in the case of a disaster. Be informed about possible emergencies in your area. Make a plan that covers where you'll go in an emergency. Build a kit with the things you need to survive. There's no one more capable of planning for your situation than you. Start your plan today. Go to ready.gov/myplan.
They call me Maxie, but I prefer tripod. I was your above-average four-legged homie, and then wham, bam, minivan. Some people pity me. Now that's lame. I still run, fetch, and swim. And the ladies love me. I'm the ultimate wingman. Just don't ask me to high five.
Because of you, I feel not alone in this world. And you let me know that it only takes one person to make you feel wanted.
Welcome back to a Justice Conversation. You're listening to Suave Gonzalez and Dr. Brian O'Neill and Dr. August Harris. She's always going to be here with us, in case y'all don't know. Before we went on a commercial break, you was talking about the science.
Right.
You know, let's get to the bottom line.
Right.
That this science can help people in prison demonstrate to the courts that at the time of the arrest, 18 in one day, their mind wasn't fully developed. Because if we go remember, the United States Supreme Court did rule that the mind of a person do not really fully develop to their 25. Mm-hmm. But they was only going to apply it to those that committed crimes before the age of 18.
Mm-hmm.
So how can this science that you are introducing today on this show, a Justice Conversation, could help thousands and thousands of people out there? How can we use this science to demonstrate to the court that our mind wasn't fully developed?
Well, I mean, the goal is to reduce crime. And so that's the number one objective. We're not trying to pass the cost to a different department. We're not trying to excuse people that commit crime. I believe on a tough on crime policy. The question is, what is the policy going to be? So just legalizing things or getting rid of 3 strikes you're out or whatever, those things aren't going to reduce crime. Now, so what we need to do is the science is already established. There's been dozens and dozens of really good long-term clinical studies that have used this technique of measuring brain waves, trying to improve those brain waves through non-invasive techniques. We don't put electricity into the brain. We don't, break your head open. It's nothing like that. It's non-invasive. It could be done in this room with the clothes that you're wearing on today. And so what we tried to do is improve that. Now, there's been lots of studies that worked with addiction. So that's a problem in prison. Roughly half of the people in prison have some kind of substance abuse or full-fledged addiction, because there are 2 different things actually, problem. 3/4 are associated with drugs with their crime. That's a lot of people. So we think that people in prison are the people to start with because they're the most expensive to deal with. I mean, when you look at the state budget, the state spends about $2,800 a person for all of your services. And the city picks up about another $1,500 worth. So for about $4,000 a year, we can pay for everything that the state gives you. The police, the courts, the trash removal, your schools, everything. Water department, all that. And but a prison costs about $50,000 a year. You divide the population by the amount of the budget last year, you get about $50,000. And so that's 20 times the difference. You're talking about 2,500 versus 50,000. That's 20 times. So that's a lot of money to spend on one person for 1 year. Now, if the system worked, and 1 or 2 or 3 or 5 years would do the job, well then, hey, that's the cost of doing business. It cost $250,000 to fix you, but we helped you. But the problem is that the recidivism rates across the country, not just Philadelphia where we're based, and not even in Pennsylvania, there's some really well-meaning people out there that are in the system that are trying to help the incarcerated people. But the results are not something to brag about. 60 to 70% come back within 3 years, depending on the crime. And when you go out, last year, the federal government did the longest and largest study ever on criminal recidivism. They went out 9 years, nationwide. And the average just goes way down. Like 3 years is about 30, 40% stay out. And then by the time you get to 9 years, 15% stay out. So that means 80%, 70, 80, 85% through the years are going back to prison. Now, 30% is placebo, right? If you did nothing in theory, 30% would get better, right? That's that sugar pill theory. So if you're doing less than placebo, what are we doing for $50,000 a year times 9 years? So we think that something else is important, and we think that well-meaning people in the system that are trying to help incarcerated people that really come to work every day in prisons, security guards, social workers, they really are trying to help people. They're just going about it with what I think is the wrong tools, and that is they're not approaching the brain. So we need to measure the brain. We measure the brain circuits as best we can. We can't see every circuit. We can't see every connection, but we get a pretty good general idea of what the brain's doing. And then we try to help that. And that what we think will help addiction, because we think that the people that are in jail.
Oh, when you say we try to help that, what does that mean? What does that look like?
Whatever's causing that chronic drug addiction and that chronic aggression or need to commit a violent crime.
Yeah, but what does that look like? Did you say we go back and tamper with somebody's brain?
Well, so what we do is we try to improve the areas that are working well and sort of inhibit the things that are the negative. Now, that's what we do in medicine all the time.
But are we tampering with somebody's brain?
Well, what we're doing is we're reestablishing, hopefully, new connection patterns. And this is what we do in medicine every day. When you go, something fell. When you go to your doctor and, you tell him you have chest pain, well, the first thing he does is he listens to your heart, he listens to the sounds, he does a blood test, x-rays, CAT scan, whatever, and he comes up with this idea and says, okay, your heart valve is abnormal. And then he says, now what is abnormal? Meaning that the way one person's heart valve is working is associated or correlated with chest pain. So we know that that valve is not good. And he goes and fixes the hardware. He'll give you cholesterol medication to physically reduce the fat in your arteries. He'll improve the valve. He'll take the fat out of the sort of rotor-reader through your arteries. It's a physical thing. And then he does some long-term lifestyle things. Hopefully your doctor will refer you to a dietitian who will teach you how to eat again, who will help you stop smoking, etc. So what we do with the brain is the same idea. We're saying what circuit patterns are associated with unhealthy behavior, non-adaptive behavior. We don't need to hit people on the head anymore to get what we want. That was good 100,000 years ago. It doesn't work today. So we take what we know to be correlated with unhealthy behavior, and we say, okay, that circuit pattern always shows up, or that area tends to frequently be associated with addiction. And then we try to modify that and help that so it looks more like the person who's not doing those things. And that's what your cardiologist is doing too. He knows when to take you off the cholesterol medication because he'll retest your blood and say, hey, your cholesterol is normal now. Normal based on what? Normal based on what other people that don't have symptoms are.
But I still ain't get the answer that I wanted.
Okay.
Can I say
Right?
one thing too?
One second, Doc. Because what I want to know is,
Go ahead.
we talking about human beings here.
Yeah.
We talking about human lives. And you talking about curing a problem that half of America got, which is incarceration and addiction. Right? If we cure one, we probably could cure the other one. So I still want to know, like, how would you go about that? What would that look like? Okay. If I give you 6 of the words that, according to the criminal justice system, criminals in the United States, how long would it take for you to say, give me those 6 and a year that would not have the desire to be in the streets or use drugs? What would that look like with your process?
Yeah.
Right. So first, let me just correct the timeline. So it's generally 20 to 40 sessions that are an hour long. And you can knock that out in a few months to 6 months. So it's not even a year. It's several months. 6 months is what we kind of typically think of, 6, 8 months. And what we physically do, or not me, but people that are in the field that do it, is the person sits in the chair just like I am, or in a recliner or something like that, and they look at a television screen. And that television screen is playing a video, like a movie or a video game like Pac-Man or Star Wars or something else. And what's doing the therapeutic part is not what's on the TV. The TV just kind of holds your attention, so you're kind of focused in on something. That TV monitor that the person's watching that's playing the video game is hooked up to the technician's computer. That computer is going to give visual and auditory rewards when the brain gives us what we're looking for. Okay. Now, the person's not thinking anything. It's not like we're telling them, think of the beach or think of your girlfriend or something like that. The brain actually wants to readjust and correct. It does it every day. All of our brains are correcting all the time. You know, you're in a restaurant with smoky area, your brain's adjusting for that. Someone sets off your stress and cortisol levels, your brain adjusts for that. There's rewiring after trauma. Our brain are always going back and forth, just like our heart system is always adjusting. You know, you run a marathon, you sit back and watch TV. Your heart is adjusting to all that. But there's some people that can't adjust back to normal or quote unquote healthy. So what we try to do is give them that stimulation to kind of put them in to get more of the connection patterns that we want. Now that is done. It's non-invasive. We're not doing anything. We're not giving drugs. We're not going into the brain. Session takes about an hour. You keep all your clothes on. You watch the show. And then after an hour of training that's painless, you walk away, you go home. And so what the idea is like physical therapy. You come in, you do a session, and then you come the next day or a couple days later, do another. It's like weight training. You know, you start with 10 pounds, then you go to 12 pounds and 15 pounds, and eventually you got these big biceps. But you didn't start off with big biceps, but you'll get there. And so that's what this process does. So specifically is we'll take a brain map, we'll analyze what's wrong, because you got to diagnose and analyze before you even step foot into that world of the brain. And then you do this sort of treatment process, which helps readjust these connection patterns. And lo and behold, the studies are showing that when people get to the end of the 20 to 40 sessions, that their behavior also has improved, or mental states, because this is done for things like ADD and epilepsy and depression and things that are not typically considered criminal. These better, healthier brain connection patterns are going to give the effect also of the less need for drugs or addiction, substance abuse, and reduce and improve your ability to deal with people so you don't get into the criminal behavior part.
If I'm a skeptic in correction or in the field of rehabilitation, as correction call it, I would say that you trying to use prisoners as guinea pigs, and that this experiment has been done before with the Stanford experiment in the 70s and 80s. So what is the difference? What would you say to them skeptics out there? Because we do have a lot of them out there.
Right. Well, first of all,
so what would you say to them?
Okay. Well, first of all, the test that was done in the 70s and the 80s with Stanford was not that. What they were showing was, people always misinterpret those studies. They always think like, oh, people can be forced to do bad things to others if they're incentivized and so forth. That's not actually what the study says. What the studies actually, because if you read the actual studies, when people were told and forced to do certain things like increase the electricity, the stimulation they thought that they were giving the other person, they don't do it. It's what those studies show is that people will do anything to another if there's a greater good involved. That's what those studies show. But I understand your point that people can misuse these things. But just to correct, the Stanford study...
Prisoners have been used as guinea pigs. I understand what you're saying. And it's not Stanford, like you say, but maybe thinking of something like in the 40s and 50s, prisoners were experimented on using LSD.
Oh, up into the 70s.
Yeah. And so the people's brains were damaged by being experimented on. And prisoners are the ones who are most vulnerable. That's why they were used that way.
Well, 100%. I mean, up into the 70s, they were experimenting with LSD. The CIA had decades-long programs. Okay, but the point here is, no, we're not experimenting. It's already been done with people in and out of prison. And so, I mean, we're sort of having a bad experiment now, don't you think? Like, we're putting them into these prisons for years at a time, throwing a Bible at them and saying, salute you, we'll see you in 3 to 5, 10. I mean, the average sentence in Pennsylvania is about 5.5 years. So see you in 5.5 years, buddy. And, that's probably cruel. I mean, if there's a moral issue to be said, it's this expectation that what we're doing frequently that we know is not working for decades. This is not the first year that we've come up upon this conclusion, We've known at least since the 50s that criminal recidivism was bad. So
And
to keep doing the same bad thing, there's got to be a problem there.
So, y'all heard the doctor. There has to be a problem there. We're going to finish this conversation. When we come back right now, we got to go on a commercial break. You listening to a Justice Conversation on Usala Radio with Dr. August Terra, Dr. Brian O'Neill, Suave Gonzalez, and Dr. Larry Tereski. We'll be right back.
Sometimes the things we do or say can make others feel hurt, excluded, or isolated. Everything you say and do creates an impact.
How am I supposed to save the whole world?
You can't think about saving the world. You have to think about saving one person.
Because of you, someone's entire life can change. You don't have to be a superhero to have a positive impact.
Friends?
Friends.
What do you think you're doing, Kevin?
Was just gonna drive home.
There are several warning signs present that you shouldn't be driving.
Like hearing voices?
Like your text-to-emoji ratio?
Oh man, the selfies.
Selfie. Nailed it. We all have warning signs that let us know that we're probably not okay to drive. Mine is pretending to be your subconscious.
Greg, come on man, let's split a ride home.
Welcome back to a Justice Conversation. Before we went on a break, the doc was saying there is a problem. What is the problem that we have in the state of Pennsylvania?
We spend too much money for really bad outcomes.
Such as?
Well-meaning people, but we're not, there's a gentleman at the University of Pennsylvania, Adrian Raine. He's the head of their criminology, psychiatry, and psychology department. Wrote a great book called The Anatomy of Violence. Great book from 2014. And it talks about these anatomical issues and so forth. And he uses a term, guilty knowledge. I had done a video with University of Penn back in 2014, along with Jefferson Hospital and MIT. And we got these professors together that all came for free. We all worked for no money. Nobody made any money. In fact, it cost me time and money. And we made these series of videos that tried to explain everything that I've been saying today about how the brain works, what we can do about it, and specifically talking about addiction and criminal behavior. And he used the term guilty knowledge. Like, now we know that the brain is the source of our problem. That maybe other things cause the problem, like your bad parents or a bad accident or bad nutrition, but now the problem has left you with a problem in the brain, just like heart disease. You may have been eating fat McDonald's for 30 years, but now when the problem is...
Whoops. Go ahead, keep on.
But now when the problem is the brain, that's what you got to fix, right? So in heart disease, you've been eating poorly, but when you go to the hospital for a heart attack, they don't say, okay, let's talk about your hamburger and cheeseburger problem. No, they talk about the physical problem in your heart, the fat that had accumulated over these 30 years. And it's the same with the brain. The environment may have helped cause these bad connections, because most of the time it's not a genetic cause of addiction or crime. Those are extremely, extremely rare events. So, but the problem is, once you get the guy who's a criminal, you got the conviction, now what do you do with him? Well, we know that something happened to the brain at some point. Now, we can talk about his mother and father and how he was neglected as a child, but that's history. I can't change that now, nor can he. What's done is done. We got to deal with what's in front of us. Now we have a person who has an unhealthy brain. What do we do about it? Do we put him in jail for 5.5 years with a Bible and give him a salute and hope he never comes out, which 95% of them come back out? Or do we try to do corrective measures? So Adrian Raine says, we have guilty knowledge. We now know what the deal is. We don't know everything about the brain. There's a lot of mysteries. What is consciousness and how does the brain really, really work at fundamental levels? But we have a pretty good idea of where the story begins and what road we should take. If we keep on taking this carrot and a stick approach of, I'm just going to make life really miserable for you until you figure it out. If that's the road we're going to take, we're in for another years and decades of very expensive failing programs. And that's what we're seeing in the criminal reform movement. We're saying, we can't take the cost of drugs, or you know what, let's legalize drugs. Oh my God, the people are going to jail for 30 years because of a little bit of crack. Okay, well, let's just change the sentencing. Well, you still have a problem on the streets. You haven't done anything. And so the problem is, how do you reduce? The goal is reduction of crime. And the brain is directly causative, the cause of the criminal act. And so what do you do with that? We have guilty knowledge now. It's immoral to keep doing what we're doing. It's immoral to take a 15-year-old and put him in jail as the only source of treatment. I don't say that prisons are bad. I'm saying, we need prisons. I mean, there are people that should not be on the street. Trust me, I've been in prisons. There are people that should not come out.
But I would say that's very few.
It's very few, but we also don't know because we've never actually tried to treat them. We've just been locking them up and putting them in closets and putting them in timeouts at $50,000 a year.
At great harm to those people as well.
And they come out and they generally, within 3 years, do it again. So
let me ask you, plain and simple.
Yeah.
As a scientist,
yes.
Do you think that we will ever eradicate mass incarceration in the United States?
Mass incarceration?
Yes.
Yes. I'm not sure in my lifetime, but yes, we will. We're going to solve this problem the easy way or the hard way. We cannot have 6 to 8% inflation costs every year on the prison programs. We spent over $2.5 billion to deal with 45,000 people. There's a lot. We could be putting that money in other things: bridges, roads, schools, prevention programs, low interest loans for entrepreneurs, lots of other things, help to immigration and minorities.
Yes.
There's so many other things we could do. I'd give you a laundry list if you gave me $2 billion. What I'm saying is you need prisons. We just got to use them more judiciously, more scientifically, because now we have the guilty knowledge. Now we know what we didn't know in 1970 when I was born. We didn't know. There were 9 prisons or 7 prisons back then. We got 27 now. Okay? Phoenix was just built. $400 million.
Yep.
And almost double that when you include the cost of the interest on the debt and the overruns from the construction, $800 million. Wow, that's a lot of dough. So
he's talking about SCI Phoenix, a prison in Montgomery County here in Pennsylvania.
But I'm not just focusing on...
They look like a concentration camp from the inside and outside.
I'm not concentrating on one particular prison. I'm not trying to label one prison or one city or one state. This is a national problem.
Absolutely.
And the reason why 5,000 counties or 5,700 or so that each have a prison system and 50 states that each have in accumulation about 600 state prisons, we're looking at over 6,000 correction systems, okay? Or at least incarceration locations. Nobody's doing it right. Nobody can get better than 30% success at 3 years, but that's placebo. I mean, our standards have to be higher than 30%. So there's a moral issue here. We need to use prisons because prisons are a place where people will not hurt themselves or hurt others, at least out in public.
Well,
but we need to do some reform, brain-based treatment.
That one statement, though, because prisons actually perpetuate self-harm.
They're absolutely
and suicide.
Well, the way we use them now, they are criminogenic. There's many studies on that. Many studies, federal and state. There's no question. We already said that at 9 years, 15% succeed. That means 15% are not even placebo. So there's no question that when you incarcerate people for short or even certainly long term, that the only place that they can succeed is in a prison. Mm-hmm. That is that's where they work.
And the prison is a punitive environment.
Which is fine, but it's too expensive to do it that way.
Well, I'm saying that's not fine, the idea that the prison is a punitive environment.
Right, but I'm saying it's too expensive to continue the game that we've been playing for 40 years.
I hear that.
Or arguably 200 years since Walnut Street Jail here in Philadelphia. I could walk there from my house.
Basically, it's in slavery because nothing really changed.
Well,
changed. They just call it incarceration now, the prison system, but it's really a slave system.
There is a political issue here, but my focus is on reducing crime. I want to see the numbers legitimately go down and stay down.
Right.
I don't think we need to have, because the addiction wasn't like this 50 years ago.
I think it's another thing that you're bringing to us that's really fascinating here. And you
I
mentioned
got a response to that real quick, Doc. You saying addiction wasn't like that 50 years ago. Was that because a race issue?
Well,
and because the number of whites that was using, there was addicts back in 30, 40, 50 years ago versus the number of addicts we see today, or what the media portrayed to be as addicts today in the neighborhoods.
Right. I see your point, and there certainly was a purposeful, intentional desire to bring drugs into cities and so forth. There's no question about that. That's not backroom talk anymore. But what do we do about it now? If we just go after racist people, that's not going to bring the problem down. I mean, even today, there's 3 times as many whites addicted and die than there are of minorities. So, I mean, there's an argument on both sides. But the point is, what do we do now? Philadelphia, particularly where I live, is the #1 death spot for addiction in the country. That's a bad statistic to be
and
saying.
I agree with
and
you.
And Allegheny County is #2.
And I'm going to agree with you. And a lot of people out there, and I hope y'all watching this, y'all going to hate me for saying this. But a lot of the people that we see out in the streets, addicts today, they're now my neighbors.
Yeah.
They are invading my neighborhood.
Mm-hmm.
They coming from suburban to hang out down here.
Yeah, and they cost money. Yeah, you know, I talked to a number of legislators.
And I say that to say this, right? Mm-hmm. That people always want to criminalize my neighborhood, saying, well, it's going down Kensington. No, let's talk about these people are coming from well-to-do families,
100%.
Montgomery County and then beyond that.
Most do.
To come down here.
100%.
And then the media say it's Kensington, it's your neighborhood.
No,
let's be clear. A lot of them are not our neighbors because I know people that live in the same houses. When I went away for 30 years and they work, they maintain their property, they do everything. Those are not our neighbors. Those are people that have invaded our neighborhood.
100%.
And I think that people need to start talking about that more, because then we could get to the root of the problem.
I've talked to dozens of politicians over the years, 7 years now, and sometimes they say to me, "Look, I'm in a wealthy area. I don't have this problem. Like, it is a problem, but my constituents don't vote for it." And I say, "Listen, your constituents are the ones dying in Kensington. They're the wealthy coming down. That they grew up in Center City. They grew up in the suburbs." Wealthy Montgomery and Bucks counties, they die in Kensington. So, there's a problem on all sides of the street. Rich, poor, white, black, male, female, no matter what racial or class you want to put, cohort you want to create, addiction is there. And everyone knows someone that has died of addiction, and it's unnecessary. Nobody's free-willing, choosing to live the addiction. Nobody says, even in your worst days, I think I'll be a heroin addict. Maybe that'll help things. We get drawn in. Maybe it was a prescription that started it. Maybe it was an injury. Maybe it was your friend egging you on one day on a Saturday night party. Whatever it was that started the process, you're in it now. Well, what do we do? Correction is the mandate, the constitutional mandate of every city and state in this country and federal system. And what I'm saying is we need to incorporate the brain into this program, into this corrective. We need prisons. We need to use them more judiciously. Maybe we can avoid a lot of incarceration. I'm not saying everyone has to be incarcerated. I'm just saying that it's okay to have them. We just need to use them more efficiently.
In 5 seconds or less.
Yes.
Tell the audience out there, we're going to continue this conversation next week with Dr. Larry Teretsky. We're doing a special on this conversation for the next 2 shows. Get them a little preview what's coming on next week.
Oh, there's so much to talk about. We can talk about more about the brain, how this brain works, more about the treatment and evaluation process, the implications, the social implications of this.
So next week,
yeah,
we are going to talk about the social implications of this kind of treatment in our correctional facility and why, again, people, why we should support this treatment. I hear people saying, my son was 18 in a day. This could be the treatment that could get your son out of jail. This could be the science. I remember when the United States Supreme ruled and on Roper, a lot of people did not believe that juveniles, lifers, would come out of prison based on science. But again, another Larry Steinberg.
Yes, Larry Steinberg.
Proved to the Supreme Court. Proved to the Supreme Court that this science was for real, and the Supreme Court came back 10 years after they ruled on Roper and said you cannot keep a juvenile in prison for life.
You want to hear the quotation? This is Steinberg. The capacity for self-regulation in the adolescent brain is slow to develop, while other brain changes ratchet up sensitivity to reward. This combination leads to increased impulsivity and risky behavior, and studies also show that this effect is heightened when teens are in the presence of peers.
So, we have to leave.
That's great, Doc.
You
really are on it.
But I leave you with this. Could another Larry change the landscape of the legal system and help brothers come out of prison?
Got to start
We'll
somewhere.
see you next week. You're listening to A Justice Conversation on Osala Radio. And our show is produced by Dylan, and it's sponsored by Westchester University.